Good evening, and welcome back to Drift Through History. Tonight's story begins on the Mongolian steppe in the last decade of the 12th century, in one of the most violent and turbulent landscapes on the face of the earth, with a boy of perhaps 14 who walked to the camp of a man who was not yet famous and offered to serve him. The man was Temujin, not yet Genghis Khan, not yet anything except the leader of a small clan trying to survive in a world where survival was not guaranteed, and where being someone's enemy could mean death before dawn. The boy was the son of a blacksmith and the younger brother of a man named Gelme, who was already in Temujin's service. His name was Subutai. He would serve Temujin, and then Temujin's son, until he was 70 years old. He would never lose a major battle. He would direct more than 20 campaigns. He would conquer 32 nations. He would win 65 pitched engagements. He would lead armies across more ground than any commander in history before or since, from the Mongolian steppe to the gates of Vienna, from the Yellow Sea to the Adriatic, through desert and mountain and forest and frozen river, in heat that killed horses and cold that killed men, against enemies who ranged from the finest cavalry in the Eurasian steppe to the armoured heavy infantry of the Hungarian plain to the siege-hardened garrison troops of the walled cities of China. He is the most successful military commander in the history of the world, who almost nobody outside of military history circles has ever heard of. That last fact, the obscurity, the absence from the popular narrative of military genius, is itself worth a moment's reflection. Alexander is famous. Caesar is famous. Napoleon is famous. Subutai is not. The explanation is partly about who stories get told and by whom. The written accounts of Subutai's campaigns that survive in sufficient detail to reconstruct what actually happened are primarily Persian, Chinese and Russian sources, accounts written by the people he defeated, filtered through the trauma of conquest, and not transmitted in the forms and through the cultural channels that shape Western popular memory. There is no Herodotus for Subutai, no Plutarch to write his life and compare it to Caesar's or Alexander's. The Mongol secret history, the primary Mongolian source for the period, gives us fragments and glimpses rather than the sustained narrative that Subutai's career deserves. What we have is enough to reconstruct the main lines of what he did. What we don't have is the kind of intimate literary record that makes a historical figure feel present to a modern reader in the way that, say, the letters of Caesar or the meditations of Marcus Aurelius make their authors feel present. But the record we do have is sufficient to establish a claim that most military historians who have studied it find difficult to dispute, that Subutai was the greatest operational commander in the history of warfare, measured by any objective criterion: the number of battles won, the quantity of territory conquered, the consistency of success against diverse enemies over a career spanning more than 4 decades, and above all the specifically operational achievement of coordinating armies separated by hundreds of miles to converge on objectives with a timing precision that the communications technology of the 13th century could barely support, and that no other commander of his era came close to matching. Tonight we are going to tell his story. Not just the battles, though the battles are extraordinary and they deserve the detail I'm going to give them, but the world that produced him, the civilization that trained him, the specific qualities of the Mongol military system that made his achievements possible, and the broader question of what his career tells us about the relationship between individual genius and systemic advantage. Subutai was exceptional. He was also the product of something exceptional, a military organization and a strategic culture that gave exceptional talent the tools and the context it needed to express itself on the largest possible scale. Before we begin, Take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is genuinely what you come here for. Drop your city and your local time in the comments. Now dim the lights, let the room settle, you have nowhere to be, and let us go to the steppe. The Mongolian steppe in the late 12th century was not the wasteland that the word steppe might suggest. It was, rather, one of the most militarily productive environments in the history of the world, not in the sense that it produced wealth or comfort, but in the sense that it produced warriors of a specific and devastating quality. The steppe was a vast grassland ecosystem, stretching from Manchuria in the east to the Carpathian Basin in the west. Roughly 4,000 miles of rolling grass and seasonal extremes, supporting populations of nomadic pastoralists who raised horses and cattle and sheep and moved through the landscape in annual cycles that followed the grass. The specific conditions of steppe life, the constant need to manage large herds across wide areas, the exposure to weather that required both toughness and flexibility, the endemic raiding and counter-raiding between tribal groups that provided continuous low-level military experience from childhood onward, produced a population that was, by the standards of the settled world that surrounded it, extraordinarily militarily capable at the individual level. The steppe horse archer was the most versatile light cavalry weapon in the history of the pre-modern world. Raised on horseback from early childhood, the average Mongolian warrior of the late 12th century could shoot a composite bow from the saddle at a full gallop, hitting a moving target at 100 meters, while controlling his horse with his legs alone. The composite bow itself was a technological masterpiece, a laminated construction of wood, horn and sinew that stored enormous elastic energy in a short, recurved package that could be used from horseback, unlike the longbow that required a stable stance. The Mongolian composite bow of the 13th century had a draw weight of approximately 160 pounds, compared to the English longbow's 150 pounds, and was accurate to perhaps 300 meters. A significant tactical advantage over almost any other missile weapon of the period. A Mongolian warrior carried two bows, a longer one for distance shooting, a shorter one for close work, and perhaps 60 to 80 arrows of different types, including armor-piercing bodkin points, broad-headed cutting points, and whistling signal arrows whose specific sounds conveyed tactical information across a battlefield. The Mongolian horse was another decisive factor, and it deserves more attention than it usually receives. The Mongolian breed was and is a small animal by the standards of the European warhorse, shorter, stockier, shaggy-coated, with a head that European observers consistently found ugly. But it was extraordinarily hardy in ways that European warhorses were not. It could survive on grass alone, requiring no grain to maintain its working condition. It could paw through ice and snow to find grass underneath. It tolerated cold that killed horses bred for temperate climates. It could travel distances that would have been impossible for the heavier, grain-fed European destrier. Mongol armies typically gave each warrior multiple horses, sometimes as many as 5 or 6, though 2 or 3 was more typical for ordinary soldiers, rotating them to distribute the physical stress of campaigning. This meant that Mongol armies could move at speeds that their opponents consistently found incomprehensible, covering distances that settled military traditions had no framework for anticipating. The steppe was also, in the late 12th century, a world of perpetual political instability. The tribal confederacy of the Mongolian plateau, Mongols, Tatars, Merkits, Naimans, Karaits, and dozens of smaller groups, were in constant competition for grazing land, for horses, for the women and children taken in raids, and for the political prestige that came from successful raiding. alliances formed and dissolved seasonally. Leaders rose and fell. Betrayal was so common that loyalty beyond the immediate family group was a rare and valuable commodity. It was into this world that Temujin had been born, into a family of minor Mongol aristocracy that had seen its fortunes collapse when his father was poisoned by rival Tatars, when Temujin was about 9 years old, leaving the family destitute and abandoned by their followers. Temujin's early life, the years of poverty and constant danger, the period of his capture and enslavement by a rival clan, his escape, his gradual rebuilding of a following through a combination of personal charisma, political intelligence, and military effectiveness, had made him, by the time Subutai came to him, a man in his mid-30s who understood the steppe political world at its most fundamental level, and who was beginning to do something with that understanding that the steppe had never seen before. But before we follow Subutai into those campaigns, it is worth dwelling more on the instrument he was given to work with, the Mongol military system at its mature form, because the campaigns only become fully intelligible when you understand what made the army so devastatingly different from everything it encountered. The Mongol army was not merely cavalry. That is the first and most important correction to the popular understanding of why the Mongols won. The cavalry, the horse archers who formed the bulk of every Mongol field force, was the army's primary striking arm, but what made it lethal was the way it was combined with intelligence, engineering, psychology, and logistics in a unified operational system that no contemporary enemy could match on all dimensions simultaneously. You could sometimes match the Mongols in one area. You could not match them in all of them at once. The tactical system of the Mongol army in the field was built around several core techniques that, when combined, were nearly impossible to defend against without adopting them yourself. The Mangudai was the unit of feigned retreat, a forward force that engaged the enemy aggressively, then broke and ran, drawing the pursuing enemy force out of its formation and into terrain and a tactical situation that the main Mongol force had pre-selected for the counterattack. The technique worked because it required discipline almost impossible to maintain. To run convincingly when the enemy is pressing you, without the rout becoming actual, requires soldiers whose instinct to flee has been replaced by the understanding that the retreat is part of the plan, and that turning at the prearranged moment is the moment the plan becomes victory. Mongol soldiers could execute this reliably because they had been practicing it their entire military lives. Their opponents consistently failed to recognize it for what it was because their own military experience told them that when an enemy runs, the correct response is pursuit. The tulugma was the standard Mongol battle formation, wings deployed far to either side of the center, designed to sweep around the flanks of the enemy formation while the center engaged frontally. Combined with the Mangudai's feigned retreat, which drew the enemy forward while the wings moved outward, the tulugma created a double envelopment that destroyed enemy formations by surrounding them rather than simply meeting them head-on. This standard countermeasure, extending your own flanks to prevent the envelopment, diluted the force defending the center and often created the very breakthrough the Mongol center was looking for. There was no good answer to the combination of these techniques in the tactical vocabulary of most 13th century armies. The psychological warfare component of the Mongol military system was as deliberate and as sophisticated as any of its physical elements. The specific reputation that the Mongols cultivated, of total destruction for those who resisted, relative mercy for those who surrendered, was not simply the unplanned consequence of their methods. It was a strategic communication, carefully maintained and deliberately propagated, whose purpose was to reduce the military cost of future conquest by increasing voluntary surrender rates. Cities that submitted were taxed and administered. Cities that resisted were destroyed and their populations killed, with a thoroughness that was designed to be both complete and visible to the surrounding region. The survivors who spread the word of what had happened at Nishapur or Ryazan or Kiev were, in a sense, serving Mongol strategic interests by ensuring that the next city in their path had accurate information about the cost of resistance. The Mongol army also pioneered the systematic use of terror as an operational multiplier in ways that had specific tactical applications as well as strategic ones. The practice of driving refugee populations, people fleeing from destroyed cities and advancing Mongol forces ahead of the main army into the next defensive position had multiple effects. It consumed the defenders' food supplies, crowded their fortifications, spread fear among the population, and created tactical confusion when the Mongols arrived behind the mass of fleeing people. This was operational design, not accident. What Genghis Khan did to steppe political organization was in many ways more revolutionary than what he did to the settled world around him. He did not simply conquer and subordinate the tribal confederacies of the Mongolian plateau. He dissolved them and rebuilt the social structure from scratch. Tribal identity was abolished as an organizing principle. People were assigned to decimal military units, squads of 10, companies of 100, regiments of 1,000, divisions of 10,000, that mixed members of different tribal backgrounds, ensuring that loyalty flowed up the military hierarchy to the Khan, rather than horizontally to kinsmen. The clans that had previously governed social life became militarily irrelevant. What mattered was your unit and your officers. The principle that advancement within the military system was based on demonstrated ability rather than birth created a meritocracy of violence that attracted talented soldiers from across the steppe and that rewarded exactly the qualities: tactical intelligence, physical endurance, tactical aggression combined with strategic patience that Subutai would demonstrate across 4 decades of command. Subutai entered this world as a teenager and rose within it through what the secret history of the Mongols calls a remarkable natural aptitude for warfare, though the specific phrase the text uses is typically translated more colloquially as something like the exceptional young man. He rose to command 1,000 men, a Minghan, the regimental unit of the Mongol decimal system, and distinguished himself sufficiently in the campaigns of the early 13th century that he was included among the 4 dogs of war, the 4 generals whom Genghis Khan used as his primary operational commanders for the most difficult and consequential missions. The other 3 were Jebe, Mukhali, and his own brother Yelme. The term dogs of war was not derogatory. It was a specific honorific that indicated the generals whom the Khan trusted to pursue his enemies, with the relentless ferocity and tactical intelligence that the hardest campaigns required. The dogs of war were off the leash in ways that other commanders were not. Genghis Khan's own recorded description of Subutai's role speaks to the quality of the trust. "I will ward off your enemies as felt cloth protects one from the wind," Subutai had reportedly said to Genghis Khan early in his service. The image is specific and steppe appropriate. Felt, the compressed wool that was the primary insulating material of nomadic life, the thing that stood between a human body and the wind that could kill you on the open steppe. Subutai positioning himself as that protective layer between the Khan and danger is a statement not of civility, but of professional dedication, the warrior who had made the Khan's survival and success his life's work. The early campaigns in which Subutai developed his operational craft were conducted in a world whose specific physical texture is worth dwelling on, because the abstraction of operational analysis, The maps with arrows, the troop dispositions, the casualty figures can obscure what it actually felt like to be part of a Mongol army on the move. A Mongol campaign was a migration of a specific kind, not the seasonal migration of pastoral communities following the grass, but a directional, purposive movement across hundreds or thousands of miles of terrain that the army's scouts had surveyed and that its logistics had calculated in advance. The column of a Mongol tumen on the march extended for miles along the track it was following, the horses spaced to prevent overgrazing of the verge on either side, the spare horses rotating in and out of use, the herds of cattle and sheep that provided emergency food moving alongside the military formation in the traditional nomadic manner that the Mongol army had adapted to operational purposes. The sound of it, thousands of horses, the jingle of equipment, the movement of animals, the voices of men in a dozen languages as the army incorporated captive specialists and allied contingents, would have been audible at distances and in ways that left an acoustic footprint on the landscape for miles around. The speed at which a Mongol army could move was not simply a function of horse quality. It was the product of the specific operational discipline that Subutai and the other senior commanders maintained, the march discipline that kept the column moving at a pace the horses could sustain over days, rather than a pace that burned them out in a single day. The watering stops calculated to the specific water sources that reconnaissance had identified, the grazing rotations that maintained horse condition over weeks and months of continuous travel. Mongol armies could cover 40 to 50 miles per day in short, intensive pushes, and 15 to 20 miles per day on sustained campaign marches, figures that European armies of the period, dependent on grain-fed horses and slower-moving supply wagons, could not approach. The night camps of a Mongol army on campaign were organized with the same operational precision as the march and the battle. The horses were picketed and rotated to fresh grazing. Sentries were posted in expanding rings around the camp at distances that gave early warning of approaching forces. The commander's encampment was at the center of a defensive arrangement that could be reorganized for movement in hours, rather than the days that a medieval European army required to break its camp and reform for march. The speed of both movement and response that the operational record documents was the product of this constant organizational discipline, maintained not just in the field, but in the daily routines of an army that lived its professional life as a total institution, with almost no separation between the military and the domestic. The early campaigns in which Subutai developed his operational craft were the campaigns against the Jurchen Jin dynasty of northern China, and against the various steppe confederacies that Genghis Khan was systematically destroying or incorporating as he unified the Mongolian plateau. The Jurchen Jin ruled the northern half of China from their capital at Zhongdu, the site of modern Beijing, and they were, in the early 13th century, one of the two most powerful states in East Asia, the other being the southern Song dynasty that ruled the southern half of China. Their army was large, their defensive infrastructure was sophisticated, and their fortifications were formidable. The campaign against them that began in 1211 introduced the Mongol armies to the specific challenge that would dominate their operational thinking for the next 2 decades. How do you destroy a civilization that defends itself with walls? The steppe cavalry that was the Mongol army's core striking force was devastatingly effective in open terrain and against armies that fought in the field. It was essentially useless against a properly defended stone wall. You cannot shoot a composite bow at a wall and damage it. You cannot ride a horse over a curtain wall 15 feet high. The walled cities of China, Persia, Russia, and Central Asia were the obstacle that the Mongols had to overcome, and the way they overcame it tells you something essential about the quality of the strategic thinking that Genghis Khan and his generals, Subutai above all, brought to the problem? The answer was engineers. The Mongols systematically incorporated the technical expertise of the peoples they conquered into their own military establishment, recruiting Chinese engineers to operate and improve Chinese siege equipment, Persian engineers to contribute their own traditions, and eventually developing a synthetic siege capability that could reduce almost any fortification given sufficient time and resources. Subutai was one of the first Mongol generals besides Genghis Khan himself to understand that engineers were as essential to mobile operations as cavalry, that the ability to take cities was the strategic complement to the ability to win battles in the field, and that an army that could do both was categorically more powerful than one that could only do one. He deployed siege engines in field battles, not just against fortifications, using catapults and arrow-throwing machines to degrade enemy formations before the cavalry closed, in a way that blended the shock effect of missile fire with the psychological effect of weapons that his opponents typically only expected from behind walls. The campaigns against the Jurchen, which ran intermittently from 1211 through 1234 when the dynasty finally fell, taught Subutai the specific operational lessons of warfare in a densely populated agricultural landscape, how to sustain an army through territory where the population was trying to deny its supplies, how to use terror as a strategic tool to reduce the will of populations to resist, how to coordinate multiple columns advancing on different axes to prevent an enemy from concentrating against any single thrust, and how to hold a campaign together logistically across distances and durations that the steppe experience had not fully prepared him for. These were not pleasant lessons, and the methods through which they were learned left scars on the landscape of China that lasted generations. But they were lessons that made him the commander who could later plan and execute a campaign against the Russian principalities that covered a larger geographic area than any military operation in the history of the ancient or medieval world. It was the campaign against the Khwarazmian Empire of Central Asia, beginning in 1219, that gave Subutai the operational canvas on which he first demonstrated the full scale of his abilities. To understand the campaign fully, you need to understand the Khwarazmian Empire at its peak, because this was not a minor power or a defenseless opponent. Muhammad Shah II had built his empire in the space of 2 decades from a relatively modest Turkic kingdom on the Amu Darya into the dominant power of the Eastern Islamic world, having absorbed Persia, Afghanistan, and the major cities of the Silk Road in a rapid expansion that by 1218 gave him control of a territory stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Hindu Kush. His army numbered in the hundreds of thousands. His cities, Samarkand, Bukhara, Urgench, Merv, were among the wealthiest and most heavily populated in the world. His confidence in the face of the Mongol threat was not entirely irrational. No previous nomadic confederation had managed to take and hold major walled cities in the way that the Mongol military system, with its incorporated Chinese engineering, could. The specific incident that triggered the war was the execution of a Mongol trade caravan at Otrar, the eastern border city of the Khwarazmian Empire, by its governor Nalchuk. The caravan may have included spies. Genghis Khan routinely used merchants as intelligence sources, and Muhammad Shah may have had genuine security concerns. What he failed to calculate was the specific weight that Genghis Khan placed on the inviolability of ambassadors and merchants operating under his guarantee. 3 subsequent Mongol ambassadors were sent to protest the caravan's destruction. Muhammad Shah had 2 of them executed, and one returned with his beard shaved, which in the cultural code of the steppe was a specific and devastating humiliation. Genghis Khan's response was the most destructive military campaign of the medieval period. The Mongol invasion plan was a masterwork of strategic deception on a continental scale. Rather than advancing on a single axis, Genghis Khan split his forces into at least 4 major columns that approached the Khwarazmian Empire from different directions simultaneously. The vanguard under Subutai and Jebe pushed south from the Sirdarya region to draw attention to the eastern approaches. A second column under Jochi attacked from the north. Chagatai and Ogedei's forces attacked the fortress city of Otrar directly, both punishing the specific culprit of the caravan massacre and fixing a significant Khwarazmian force in place. The main column under Genghis Khan himself made the move that Muhammad Shah had not imagined possible: a crossing of the Kizilkum Desert, the Red Desert, through a route that was considered impassable for a large army in the summer. The guides who knew the desert oases were obtained through a combination of inducement and coercion. The army came out of the desert southwest of Bukhara, which found itself attacked from an entirely unexpected direction. Muhammad Shah had distributed his forces across his fortified cities rather than concentrating them for a mobile defence in the field, a strategic decision whose logic was defensible, given the Mongol cavalry's apparent advantage in open terrain, but that proved catastrophically wrong against a Mongol army that could take cities. The dispersal meant that no concentration of Khwarazmian force could be assembled quickly enough to meet any of the Mongol columns before they'd already destroyed the isolated garrisons they encountered. Bukhara fell in late February 1220, after Genghis Khan assembled its population in a mosque and reportedly announced that he was God's punishment for their sins, a statement of psychological warfare so carefully calibrated that its specific dramatic quality suggests a mind that understood how stories travelled. Samarkand, the imperial capital, fell in March 1220 after a siege of 5 days. Muhammad Shah was already fleeing. Genghis Khan assigned Subutai and Jebe to pursue him. 2 tumans, 20,000 men, with orders to chase the Shah wherever he went, and if they could not capture him alive, to ensure that he never reassembled a significant military force. The pursuit was itself an epic of sustained mobile operations, covering thousands of miles as the Shah fled from city to city, each city falling to the pursuing Mongols as the Shah moved on. The Shah eventually made his way to a small island in the Caspian Sea where, in December 1220, he died, of pneumonia, most scholars think, though the shock of losing his entire empire in a matter of months was itself the kind of physical stress that can kill a man. His son Jalal al-Din tried to continue the resistance, fighting several engagements against the Mongols that demonstrated genuine military talent, before eventually fleeing to India. That gave Subutai the operational canvas on which he first demonstrated the full scale of his abilities. The Khwarazmian Empire was, by 1219, the dominant power in the Islamic East, a state that had expanded rapidly under its ruler Muhammad Shah II to control Persia, Afghanistan and the major cities of the Silk Road: Samarkand, Bukhara, Urgench, Merv, Nishapur. It was wealthy, culturally sophisticated, and governed from a position of some confidence. The Shah had recently sent a caravan of Mongol merchants through his territory, and then had the entire party massacred and the goods confiscated, on the theory, possibly correct, that the merchants were spies, and with the confidence, almost certainly misplaced, that the Mongols were too far away and too uncivilized to retaliate effectively. He was wrong on both counts. Genghis Khan's invasion of the Khwarazmian Empire in 1219 was one of the most carefully planned military operations of the medieval period. The intelligence preparation had been thorough. Mongol spies and merchants had been providing information about the empire's geography, military dispositions, and political vulnerabilities for years before the campaign began. The strategic conception was sophisticated. Rather than advancing on a broad front against the empire's defences, The Mongol invasion split into multiple columns that approached from different directions simultaneously, each column capable of independent operation, but all converging on the empire's vital centres in a sequence that prevented any effective concentration of the Khwarazmian forces. Subutai led the vanguard of the invasion, the first Mongol forces to cross into Khwarazmian territory, pushing ahead of the main army to screen its advance and to fix the Shah's attention on the most obvious axis of advance, while Genghis Khan's main columns moved by routes that the Shah had not adequately guarded. The campaign's decisive stroke was the crossing of the Kizilkum Desert, the Red Desert, by a Mongol column under Genghis Khan himself, an approach route that the Shah had considered impassable, and that the Mongols traversed with a precise logistical calculation of water supplies and march rates that left the desert fortress city of Bukhara outflanked and defenceless. When the Mongols arrived at Bukhara from the direction the Shah had not expected, the city surrendered. Samarkand, the imperial capital, fell in March 1220. The Khwarazmian Empire dissolved with a speed that astonished contemporaries. A state that had seemed solid and powerful simply ceased to exist as a coherent political entity within a few months of the campaign's opening. But the Shah himself had escaped. Muhammad Shah VII fled westward with a portion of his forces as the empire collapsed around him, eventually reaching a small island in the Caspian Sea where he died of pneumonia in December 1220, a broken man in a remarkable short time. The pursuit of the Shah was the mission that Genghis Khan assigned to Subutai and his co-commander Jebe, and the pursuit became, as the Shah died and the mission transformed, one of the most extraordinary military expeditions in history. The expedition that Subutai and Jebe conducted between 1221 and 1223 is sometimes called the Great Raid, and the name captures something real about its character, though it underestimates what the two generals were doing on Genghis Khan's behalf. It was not simply a raid. It was a strategic reconnaissance-in-force covering approximately 5,500 miles through terrain that included the Caucasus Mountains, the steppes north of the Black Sea, the Persian highlands, and the approaches to Russia, conducted by a force of approximately 20,000 men who fought their way through every significant army they encountered, and arrived back at the main Mongol forces having provided the most comprehensive intelligence survey of Western Eurasia that the Mongol command would ever obtain before the full invasion. After the Shah's death, Subutai and Jebe requested permission from Genghis Khan to continue west rather than returning east with the main army. The request was strategically motivated. Subutai had already been thinking ahead, projecting the Mongol Empire's next major expansion, and the Western territories, the Caucasus, the Pontic steppe, the Russian principalities, and beyond, were the logical next target. The expedition he was proposing was reconnaissance in service of operational planning on a timescale that no other military commander of the period was capable of, a strategic vision that could look 5 or 10 years ahead and was already identifying and gathering the intelligence that future campaigns would need. Permission granted, they moved northwest from Persia into the Caucasus, where they encountered and defeated the army of the Kingdom of Georgia, a state at the height of its own military power and with a substantial and well-trained force. The engagement is instructive. The Georgians advanced confidently and Subutai feigned retreat. The Georgian cavalry pursued. At the chosen moment, Subutai turned and destroyed them. The feigned retreat was the Mongol army's most characteristic tactical weapon, and it worked for the same reason every time. Because the opponents were trained in military traditions where a retreat was a retreat, where a withdrawing enemy was a beaten enemy to be pursued and finished, and where the concept of a controlled withdrawal executed as a tactical deception, was foreign enough to be consistently surprising even for commanders who had heard that the Mongols used it. From Georgia they moved into the Caucasus Mountains themselves, persuading the city of Derbent, which controlled the strategic pass between the mountains and the Caspian Sea, to provide guides in exchange for being spared, and emerged on the northern side to find themselves on the Pontic steppe, the vast grassland between the Black Sea and the Caspian, home to the Cuman and Kipchak confederacies, who were the most formidable nomadic cavalry power in the western steppe. The engagement that followed was a masterpiece of political warfare combined with military deception. Subutai sent emissaries to the Cumans saying that the Mongols were their kinsmen, fellow nomads of the steppe who had no quarrel with the Cuman people, and who only wanted safe passage through their territory. The Cumans, who were allied with the Alans, a Caucasian people who were also facing the Mongol advance, accepted the argument and withdrew their support from the Alans. The Mongols then destroyed the Alans without the help of their former Cuman allies, and immediately turned on the Cumans and destroyed them in turn. The Cumans who survived fled westward toward the Russian principalities, seeking protection, and their appeal to the princes of Kiev and the other major Russian states set in motion the chain of events that would culminate at the Kalka River in 1223. The Russian princes who answered the Cuman appeal assembled one of the larger forces that the Russian principalities had mobilized in the early 13th century. Estimates of the combined army range from 30,000 to 80,000, with the usual historical uncertainty about medieval numbers, but it was a substantial force that included the experienced cavalry of several major principalities. The Mongol force under Subutai and Jebi numbered approximately 20,000. What happened in the weeks before the Battle of Kalka River is a textbook demonstration of strategic patience and tactical discipline in service of a carefully chosen engagement location. The Mongols retreated before the Russian advance for 9 days. 9 days of steady withdrawal, with the Russian coalition advancing in confident pursuit, its formation becoming increasingly extended, its supply lines becoming increasingly stretched, its commanders becoming increasingly convinced that they were chasing a beaten enemy who was trying to escape. On the 9th day, on the banks of the Kalka River, in what is now southeastern Ukraine, the Mongols turned. The battle was not close. The Russian coalition was disorganized by the long pursuit, its various contingents spread across miles of steppe, its commanders not coordinating their movements. When the Mongols turned and attacked, they did so against a force that could not concentrate quickly enough to bring its numerical advantage to bear. The Cuman contingent that formed part of the Russian army fled almost immediately. They had had personal experience of the Mongols, and their survival instinct outweighed their political commitments. Their flight disrupted the Russian formations behind them. The Mongols swept through the resulting chaos with the disciplined efficiency of cavalry that had been executing exactly this kind of maneuver for decades. The Russian forces were destroyed. Several princes died in the fighting. Others were captured and were killed in the specific way that the Mongol code of honor sometimes required for enemies of high rank. They were suffocated under planks of wood, on which the Mongol commanders sat to eat their victory feast. The logic was that royal blood should not be shed on the earth. After the Kalka, Subutai and Jebi turned east. There would be no full invasion of Russia on this expedition. They had what they had come for: comprehensive intelligence about the Russian principalities, their military capabilities, their political organization or lack of it, the terrain they defended, and the specific vulnerabilities that a future full-scale invasion could exploit. Jebi died on the return journey, of what the sources do not clearly establish. Subutai returned to Genghis Khan with the intelligence and the strategic plan already forming in his mind. It would be 14 years before he returned to put it into practice. Genghis Khan died in 1227 while on campaign against the Tangut-Xixia state in northwestern China, the specific cause of his death uncertain, ranging from illness contracted during the campaign to injuries sustained in a fall from his horse, with the precise circumstances deliberately obscured in the sources because the death of the great Khan was too politically sensitive to be reported in a way that might reflect weakness or accident. He was approximately 65 years old, though his birth year is not established with certainty, and he had been campaigning almost continuously since his 20s. The Mongol Empire he left behind was the largest state in the history of the world to that point, covering an enormous swathe of Asia, from the Pacific coast to Persia and the Caspian Sea, and it faced the specific challenge that every great personal empire faces at the death of its founder: the translation of personal authority into institutional authority, the conversion of what one extraordinary man had built into something that could survive and be governed by his ordinary successors. Genghis Khan had been sufficiently far-sighted to address this problem during his lifetime, designating Ögedei, his third son, as his preferred successor, and securing the agreement of the other senior princes of the family to this designation at a Kurultai, the assembly of Chingizid princes and senior commanders, before his death. The designation was not automatically effective. It required confirmation by the full assembly after the founder's death, and the confirmation process took 2 years. The 2-year interregnum between Genghis Khan's death in 1227 and Ögedei's formal installation as Great Khan in 1229 was politically delicate but not catastrophically destabilizing, partly because the army was still on campaign, and the campaigning provided a focus that reduced the opportunities for dynastic conflict. Subutai continued operating through this period with the same professional focus that had characterized his service from the beginning. He was not a political figure in the dynastic sense, had no claim to the succession and no obvious factional allegiance, and his value to the Mongol system as its premier military commander was equally valuable to any plausible successor. Ögedei Khan, the second great Khan, was by most accounts a more convivial personality than his father and a less formidable battlefield commander, but he was an effective administrator with sufficient political skill to hold the empire together and sufficient strategic vision to continue its expansion on multiple fronts simultaneously. He established the empire's capital at Karakorum in the Mongolian heartland, created a functional postal relay system that allowed fast communication across the empire, and organized the Kurultai of 1235 that planned the western expansion that would result in the conquest of Russia and the invasion of Europe. Subutai presented the campaign plan for the western expansion at this Kurultai, laying out the strategic conception that he'd been developing since the Great Raid of 1221 to 1223. Ögedei approved it. The resources of the empire were mobilized for the largest single military operation the Mongols had yet attempted. Genghis Khan died in 1227, while on campaign against the Tangut-Xixia state in northwestern China. The succession was managed over the following 2 years, with Ögedei Khan, Genghis's third son, eventually confirmed as Great Khan in 1229. Subutai continued under the new Khan with the same professional dedication that had characterized his service to Genghis. He was, in the most literal sense, a servant of the Mongol imperial project rather than of any individual Khan, and his abilities were too valuable for the project to dispense with regardless of who held the supreme title. The campaigns of the 1230s saw Subutai directing the final destruction of the Urchin Jin dynasty in northern China, a campaign whose specific military challenges, the dense urban landscape of the North China Plain, the sophisticated fortifications of Jin cities, the determined resistance of Jin commanders, were substantially different from anything the steppe operations had prepared the Mongol armies for, and that required the full range of the engineering capabilities that Subutai had been developing since the early campaigns. The Jin general Wan Yanhida was a capable opponent who inflicted genuine defeats on the Mongol forces during this period. Subutai took losses, more losses than in many other campaigns, and the Jin resistance demonstrated that a well-organized state with good commanders and defensible terrain could make the Mongol conquest expensive, even if it could not ultimately prevent it. The last Jin stronghold fell in 1234, and the North China Plain was incorporated into the Mongol Empire. But it was the campaign that followed, the Western campaign that began in 1236, and that carried the Mongol armies through Russia, Poland and Hungary to the gates of Vienna. That represents Subutai's greatest operational achievement and the one that most clearly demonstrates the specific military genius that earns his place at the summit of the world's command hierarchy. The plan that Subutai brought to Ögedei Khan for the Western campaign was one of the most ambitious operational conceptions in the history of warfare. The basic concept was a coordinated, multi-pronged invasion of the entire Western steppe and its adjacent territories, beginning with the subjugation of the Volga Bulgars and the Kipchak steppe peoples, continuing through the full conquest of the Russian principalities and culminating in the invasion of the Kingdom of Hungary, which Subutai had identified through the intelligence gathered in 1221 or 1223 as the natural geographic objective of the Western campaign. Hungary's Great Plain was the westernmost extension of the Eurasian steppe that could support the horse-based Mongol military at scale. Beyond it, to the west, the terrain became mountainous, forested, and unsuited to Mongol cavalry operations. Hungary was the logical terminus of the empire's western frontier, and Subutai intended to take it. The political architecture of the campaign was almost as important as its military architecture. Nominal command was given to Batu Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan, and the designated ruler of the Western territories, the future Golden Horde. Subutai was his military advisor and operational commander, which meant in practice that Subutai made the strategic decisions while Batu provided the political legitimacy and the command authority over the Chinggisid princes who were expected to participate. The relationship between the two was not entirely comfortable. Batu was a prince of the blood and a man of genuine authority, not simply a figurehead for Subutai to operate behind, but it functioned well enough for the duration of the campaign, with Batu taking overall command of major engagements and Subutai directing the operational movements that determined where and when those engagements occurred. The campaign began in 1236 with the systematic subjugation of the Volga Bulgars and the Kipchak steppe peoples, the confederacies north and east of the Caspian and Black Seas that controlled the steppe corridor between the Mongol heartland and the Russian principalities. This preliminary phase lasted approximately a year and ensured that the flanks and rear of the subsequent Russia invasion were secure, eliminating the possibility of the steppe peoples providing assistance to Russian defenders. Subutai's instinct for strategic sequencing, ensuring that each stage of a campaign was properly consolidated before the next stage began, is evident here and throughout the Western campaign. In the winter of 1237, the Mongol armies crossed the Volga onto the Russian side. The choice of winter for the invasion was deliberate and represented one of Subutai's most consistently surprising strategic decisions to his opponents. conventional military wisdom of the period, in Russia, in Europe, everywhere, held that winter was not a season for major military operations. Armies needed to be sustained, horses needed to be fed, rivers needed to be crossable, roads needed to be passable. In winter, these requirements were harder to meet. The Mongol approach to winter campaigning inverted this logic. The frozen rivers became highways, allowing the Mongol cavalry to move rapidly through terrain that in summer would have been broken by marshes and rivers into disconnected zones that armies had to navigate slowly. The Russian princes, who had whatever warning time the speed of the Mongol advance allowed them, were accustomed to thinking of winter as the off-season for war. Subutai intended it as the campaign season. The speed of the Russian invasion was staggering. Ryazan, the easternmost major Russian city, was besieged and taken in December 1237, 6 days of assault ending in the complete destruction of the city and the slaughter of most of its population. The Russian princes of Vladimir had sent forces to relieve Ryazan. Those forces were destroyed at Kolomna in early January 1238. Moscow was taken in mid-January. Vladimir, the capital of the Vladimir-Suzdal Principality, and one of the great cities of Russia, was besieged on February 4th and taken 3 days later. The royal family died in the fires that the Mongols set. By the end of February, 14 Russian cities had been destroyed. Grand Prince Yuri of Vladimir had retreated northward to raise a new army. Subutai sent a flying column under the commander Burundai to find him. The Russian army was located on the banks of the Sit River, approximately 250 miles north of Vladimir, in early March 1238. The Mongol force arrived from a direction that suggested it had made a winter march through terrain that the Russian commanders had considered impassable. Another demonstration of the Mongol cavalry's ability to move through conditions that the opposition assumed were prohibitive. The Battle of the Sit River on March 4, 1238 was brief and decisive. Yuri was killed. The last significant Russian military force in the north was destroyed. The Mongol advance continued northwest toward Novgorod, one of the wealthiest cities in Russia and the center of the northern trade network that connected Russia to Scandinavia and the Baltic world. They came within approximately 60 miles of the city before turning south. The reason for the turn is debated. The spring thaw was beginning, which would have converted the terrain around Novgorod, with its extensive marshy landscape, into a nightmare for horse armies. But there may also have been strategic calculation involved. Subutai's objective was Hungary, not the subjugation of every Russian territory, and he may have judged that Novgorod was too peripheral to that objective to justify the cost of taking it in deteriorating terrain. The summer of 1238 was spent resting and reorganizing. The autumn brought new operations, this time against the southern Russian principalities and the Cuman steppe territories west of the Donau. Pereyaslavl and Chernigov fell in 1239. Then, in the autumn of 1240, the Mongol armies gathered before Kiev, the mother of Russian cities, the ancient capital of the Rus state that had given the Eastern Slavic world its first political and cultural framework. The siege lasted 9 days. The Mongols breached the walls with their siege engines and fought through the city street by street. Kiev was destroyed. Contemporary observers passing through the city's ruins in the following years described piles of skulls and bones covering the ground. The silence of a city that had been one of the largest in Europe and was now a wasteland. The road to Hungary was open. Subutai's plan for the Hungarian campaign is, by any measure, one of the great operational achievements in military history, and it is worth pausing on its specific architecture before we follow the armies that executed it. The plan called for a multi-pronged simultaneous invasion of the Kingdom of Hungary through different mountain passes, with each column converging on the Hungarian plain from a different direction to prevent concentration of the defending forces. The columns were to be separated by hundreds of miles at the start of the operation and to converge over a period of days, an operational coordination problem that the communications technology of the period made genuinely difficult, and that required both meticulous pre-campaign planning and commanders capable of adhering to operational schedules when circumstances created pressure to deviate. But the plan included something additional that shows the full scope of Subutai's strategic vision. A fourth column operating into Poland to the north of the main invasion axis, whose mission was not conquest but disruption. The Polish column, commanded by Princes Bajda and Orda, was designed to destroy the military forces of Poland before they could move south to reinforce the Hungarians and to screen the northern flank of the Hungarian invasion against the intervention of the Bohemian army of King Wenceslaus, which was the largest single military force in Central Europe, and whose intervention against the flank of the Hungarian campaign could have been dangerous. The Polish campaign was a strategic sideshow in terms of geographic objective. Subutai did not want to conquer Poland, he wanted to neutralize it. But it was an essential strategic element of the Hungarian campaign's design. The Polish column moved in early 1241, burning Krakow in late March and destroying the coalition army of Duke Henry II of Silesia at the Battle of Legnica on April 9, 1241. Henry the Pious was killed. The military force of Poland was broken. The army of King Wenceslaus of Bohemia, which had been marching to join Henry, and was still a day's march away when the battle was fought, turned back rather than face the Mongols alone. The northern flank of the Hungarian campaign was secure. 2 days later, on April 11, 1241, the main Mongol force under Batu and Subutai fought the Battle of Mohi on the Serjo River in eastern Hungary. The coincidence of timing was not accidental. Subutai had planned for both battles to happen within days of each other, ensuring that Polish forces were destroyed before they could move south, and that the Hungarian forces were engaged before any northern reinforcement could arrive. The coordination of battles separated by nearly 600 miles, occurring within 2 days of each other, is unique in military history up to the Napoleonic period and arguably beyond it. The Battle of Mohi was not the effortless Mongol victory that later accounts sometimes made it. King Bela IV had assembled a substantial Hungarian army, including contingents of Cuman cavalry and the armoured knights of the Hungarian nobility, and he had chosen his position with care, a camp on the western bank of the Sarjo River, with the river providing a protective barrier to the east, and a laager of wagons around the camp perimeter providing additional defence. The Hungarian crossbowmen had successfully repelled a Mongol attempt to cross the main bridge over the Sarjo during the night before the battle, inflicting significant casualties, and had returned to camp confident that the river line was held. Subutai's battle plan addressed this situation on 2 levels simultaneously. At the tactical level, he ordered a renewed assault on the bridge at dawn, supported by a concentrated barrage from the Mongol artillery, catapults and stone-throwing machines that Subutai had brought on the campaign specifically for situations like this, to suppress the crossbowmen who had repelled the night attack. The artillery worked. The bridge defenders were driven back from the parapet. The Mongol forces began crossing. Simultaneously, while Batu's forces fixed the Hungarian army's attention on the bridge assault, Subutai led a separate column far to the south, building a pontoon bridge over the Serjo at a different point, and bringing his force across to attack the Hungarian camp from the south and rear. The operation required Subutai to construct a bridge under campaign conditions in the dark, on a river whose depth turned out to be greater than his scouts had reported. His engineers solved the problem, but the crossing was delayed, and the critical question was whether Batu's force could hold its position at the bridge long enough for Subutai's flanking force to complete the crossing and appear on the Hungarian flank. It almost didn't work. These sources record that Batu's forces were taking significant casualties at the bridge, that the Hungarian defenders were fighting hard, and that the tactical situation at the main crossing point was deteriorating. Subutai arrived just as the pressure on Batu's men was reaching a critical point. His force struck the Hungarian flank and rear, the camp was encircled, and the battle became a rout. King Bela escaped northward with a Mongol pursuit force behind him that chased him almost to the Adriatic coast of Dalmatia before giving up the pursuit. Hungary was now open. The Mongols spent the winter of 1241-1242 consolidating their hold on the Hungarian plain, raiding west into Austria and north into Poland. Letters from the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II and Pope Gregory IX survive from this period, describing the terror that the Mongol advance had generated across Western Europe and attempting to organize a response. The response never materialized into anything that could have stopped what was coming. Vienna lay open. Italy lay open. The Mongols were planning further advances when, in December 1241, Ogedei Khan died. The death of the great Khan required the return of all Chinggisid princes to Mongolia for the Kurultai, the great assembly that would elect the new Khan. But before we follow that retreat, it is worth dwelling on the Western European response to the Mongol advance in 1241, because that response, or rather its absence, tells you something important about the political conditions that Subutai had correctly identified and that his campaign plan had been designed to exploit. Western Europe in 1241 was not unified in any meaningful military sense. The political landscape was a patchwork of competing kingdoms, autonomous ecclesiastical territories, independent city-states, and feudal principalities whose relationships with each other were defined more by rivalry and occasional warfare than by any framework of collective defence. The Holy Roman Empire under Frederick II was in open conflict with the papacy under Gregory IX, a conflict so bitter that both sides had been trading excommunications and political denunciations for years, and neither was in a position to set it aside to coordinate a common response to a threat from the east. Frederick II was occupied with his Italian possessions and his struggle with the papal party. Gregory III was dying. The other major Western kingdoms, France under Louis IX, England under Henry III, were both preoccupied with their own internal challenges and did not yet fully appreciate the scale of what was happening in the East. The letters that survive from this period show European rulers trying to understand what the Mongols were, where they could come from, and how serious the threat was, questions to which the answers were both alarming and insufficient. Frederick II sent letters to the kings of England, France, and other European rulers describing the Mongol advance and calling for a crusading response. The response was confused and slow. Some contemporaries wondered if the Mongols were the lost tribes of Israel or the army of Prester John, a legendary Christian king of the East whose kingdom had been expected by medieval Christendom for over a century. The specific military and political reality of what the Mongols actually were, what they had already done, and what they were capable of doing was not yet clearly understood in Western Europe, partly because the channels of information between Eastern Europe and the West were inadequate, and partly because the destruction of the Russian principalities had eliminated the sources of first-hand information that might have provided accurate warning. Matthew Paris, writing in England, described the Mongol advance with an eschatological intensity that tells you how completely it disrupted the European worldview. A monstrous and inhuman race of men who had burst out of their remote region, like demons released from Tartarus. The demons from Tartarus framing, the name Tartars stuck, half heard from Tatar, half conflated with the classical underworld, captures the psychological reality of the advance as Europeans experienced it from a safe but terrifying distance. Something unprecedented was happening on the eastern edge of Christendom, and the political mechanisms for responding to it collectively did not exist. If the Mongols had not been required to withdraw by Ögedei's death, if the campaign had continued through 1242 and into 1243, the specific military prospects for Western European resistance are not reassuring. The heavy cavalry of the Western knighthood was the finest shock force in Europe, individually the most capable heavy-mounted warriors in the world. They had shown at Legnica and at the dozens of smaller engagements of the Polish campaign that they could fight bravely and even sometimes effectively against Mongol tactics. What they consistently could not do was operate at the operational tempo and the logistical scale that the Mongols imposed, or counter the specific combination of horse archery, feigned retreat and flanking encirclement that the Tulughma system deployed. The military power of 13th century Western Europe was real. It was not sufficient for what was coming, for the Kurultai, the great assembly that would elect the new Khan. Batu Khan was a senior Chinggisid prince whose presence was expected. He left Hungary. The Mongol forces withdrew from Central Europe. Subutai followed, knowing that the Western campaign would not be resumed under these political conditions, knowing that the opportunity that had been created and that lay open before him was being abandoned for reasons of dynastic politics rather than military necessity. Historians have speculated for centuries about what would have happened if Ögedei had lived another year or two. The Western European kingdoms were in no condition to resist what the Mongols had demonstrated they could do. The answer to the speculation is not knowable, but the question is real. Subutai returned to Mongolia and then, after the political disruption of the succession period, was assigned to a new campaign that tested him in a different way from anything that had preceded it. The Song dynasty that ruled southern China was a different military challenge from the Jin, the Khwarazmians, the Russians, or the Hungarians. The Song had been watching the Mongol campaigns for years. They had seen the Jin fall, the Khwarazmian Empire dissolve, and the Russian principalities destroyed. They had had time to prepare, to reinforce their defences, to organise their military in response to what the Mongols had demonstrated they could do. They also held terrain that was inherently hostile to the Mongol cavalry. The river networks and rice paddies and forested hills of southern China were not the open steppe or the flat Hungarian plain, and they had a large, well-organised army under competent commanders. Subutai's Song campaign of 1246-1247 is the least documented of his major operations and the one whose specific military achievements are hardest to evaluate from the surviving sources. He conducted it 70, a fact that contemporaries found remarkable, and that the sources note with an admiration that suggests even the Mongols found it impressive. The campaign produced results, advances into Song territory, several significant engagements. But the full conquest of the Song would take another 3 decades after Subutai's death, completed under Kublai Khan, with the specific naval capabilities that the Song's maritime defence required, and that Subutai had not had the time or the resources to develop in his 1-year campaign. What is perhaps most interesting about the Song campaign is what it suggests about Subutai's character in his final years. He was 70 years old, he'd been on campaign for 55 years, he had directed more military operations than any commander alive, and when he was given a new command, he accepted it without recorded complaint or visible reluctance. there is no account of Subutai petitioning for retirement or expressing a wish to spend his final years in Mongolia. The campaign was what the Khan needed, and Subutai was the commander the Khan trusted to conduct it. That was sufficient. He returned to Mongolia in 1248 and died there in the same year. The sources do not record the specific circumstances of his death beyond its natural character. No illness named, no dramatic final statement preserved. He simply ended, as old warriors sometimes do, without ceremony proportional to what they had accomplished. The empire he had spent his life expanding continued without him. Its final form, the four great successor Khanates that divided Genghis Khan's inheritance among his descendants, was still being worked out at his death, and he would not have recognized the political arrangements that eventually emerged from the long succession struggles of the 1240s and 1250s. But the territory those arrangements governed, the eastern half of the Eurasian continent, the largest empire in history, was largely the territory that Subutai's campaigns had added to the Mongol domain. Subutai returned to Mongolia, and then, almost immediately, was assigned to a new campaign, the long-deferred invasion of the Song dynasty that ruled southern China. He was approximately 66 years old. He was given command of the campaign in 1246 at the age of 70 and conducted it until 1247 when he returned to Mongolia. He died in 1248 in Mongolia at approximately 72 years of age, an extraordinarily long life for a career military commander of his era. He died in his own bed, which was itself a remarkable achievement for a man who had spent 55 years in some of the most dangerous military operations in the history of the world. The specific qualities that made Subutai exceptional as a military commander can be analysed across several dimensions, and doing that analysis is useful both as a way of understanding him specifically and as a way of understanding what military command at the highest level actually requires. The first quality was intelligence preparation, the systematic gathering and analysis of information about the enemy, the terrain, and the political situation before a campaign began. Subutai was, by the standards of his era, and arguably by the standards of any era, extraordinarily methodical about knowing what he was going into. The Great Raid of 1221-1223 was intelligence preparation on a continental scale, conducted years before the Western campaign began. The use of merchants and travellers as intelligence sources, the dispatching of agents to assess the political relationships between the states he was planning to attack, the detailed reconnaissance of terrain and routes. These were aspects of Subutai's operational preparation that his opponents consistently failed to match. The Russian princes at Khalkha had no idea what they were facing. The Hungarian army at Mohi had intelligence about Mongol numbers and intentions that was, in some respects, better than his opponents. King Bela IV had been warned by the Cumans who had experienced the Mongols and had sought refuge in Hungary, but did not translate that intelligence into tactical preparations adequate to the threat. The second quality was operational patience, the willingness to accept short-term tactical sacrifice or suboptimal positioning in service of a longer-term operational objective. The 9-day feigned retreat before Khalkha is the clearest example. A commander without Subutai's patience might have turned and fought sooner when the conditions were less favourable. Subutai waited and waited and waited until the ground was right and the enemy was strung out and demoralised, and the battle was as close to predetermined as a battle can be. At Mohi, the willingness to accept significant casualties at the bridge while the flanking movement was completed, to keep the pressure on a defensive position that was holding despite the cost, required exactly the same quality of operational nerve. The third quality was logistical sophistication. The Mongol army's operational tempo, the distances it could cover, and the speed at which it moved, was the product of careful logistical calculation, not simply of hardy horses and tough riders. Subutai's armies moved faster than their opponents because Subutai had calculated in advance exactly what they needed, where they would get it, and how to keep them moving when normal supply systems failed. The winter campaign in Russia worked because the frozen rivers made them a highway network that was more reliable than the summer roads. The sustained campaigning in Hungary worked because the Hungarian plains grasslands could feed Mongol horses through the spring and summer. The logistical thinking was always present in the operational planning, never assumed or left to chance. The fourth quality was ruthlessness in the service of strategic objectives, the ability and willingness to use extreme violence as a calculated instrument of strategic communication. The destruction of cities that resisted was not simply brutality or bloodlust. It was the deliberate creation of a reputation, a body of evidence about what resisting the Mongols meant, that caused other cities to surrender without the cost of assault. A city that surrendered received relative mercy. A city that resisted was destroyed and its population killed. And the story of what happened there was told by survivors throughout the region. Subutai understood this instrument and used it as deliberately as he used siege engines. The specific relationship between violence and surrender probability was a strategic calculation, and the systematic destruction of resistors was the investment that reduced the cost of future operations by increasing the rate of voluntary submission. The fifth quality, and perhaps the most specifically military, was the capacity for operational level coordination, the ability to plan and execute movements of multiple armies separated by hundreds of miles in a way that produced synchronized effects at the operational objectives. The coordination of Legnica and Mohi, two major battles fought in separate theatres, planned to occur within 2 days of each other, with each creating conditions that the other depended on, is the signature achievement of this quality. It required a strategic plan clear enough that every subordinate commander understood his role and the timing he had to maintain, a communication system fast enough to convey essential information across the operational distances involved, and subordinate commanders capable enough to execute their parts of the plan even when local circumstances created pressure to deviate. Subutai provided the first two and selected for the third. The world that Subutai's campaigns changed is perhaps the most important dimension of his story. But before we get there, let us stay a moment in the experience of the people he was fighting, because the abstract numbers of 65 battles and 32 nations can float free of human weight in a way that the specific surviving accounts do not allow. The Russian chronicles that record the Mongol invasion of 1237-1240 are among the most harrowing documents in the medieval historical record, and they deserve to be read alongside the operational analysis rather than in place of it. The destruction of Ryazan is recorded in an account known as the Tale of the Destruction of Ryazan, probably written in the generation after the event from the memories of survivors, that describes the siege and fall of the city with a specificity and an emotional directness that no analytical account can replicate. The princes of Ryazan had sent to the other Russian princes for help and received none. The political fragmentation of the Russian principalities, which Subutai had identified as a key vulnerability in 1223, and which his 1237 campaign systematically exploited, meant that each principality faced the Mongol advance largely alone. When Ryazan fell, the chronicle records, and the beautiful churches, holy books and treasures were set on fire, and a great smoke went up to heaven as God's anger burned, and the pagan conquerors were drunk with blood. The Mongol advance through Russia moved so fast that the normal mechanisms of medieval resistance, the withdrawal of populations into fortified strongholds, the concentration of forces, the appeal to allies, could not be organized before the Mongols had already arrived. Cities that managed to gather their populations and close their gates before the Mongols arrived could sometimes hold out for days or weeks. Cities that were caught mid-organization fell within hours. The speed of the Mongol cavalry, covering distances of 40 to 50 miles per day on campaign, was itself a weapon. It denied the enemy the time that defensive preparation required. Subutai had designed the winter campaign specifically to maximize this advantage, and the frozen Russian rivers provided the highways that the speed required. The experience of the besieged was recorded in fragments across the chronicles. The catapults battering walls that no garrison could repair fast enough. The fires set in the suburbs to drive the population off the walls and into the interior. The mines dug under wall sections to collapse them. The crowds of people driven forward against the walls before the main assault. A specific Mongol tactic of using captured populations as involuntary human shields, forcing the defenders to either watch their own people die in the moat or open the gates. These were not barbarisms in the sense of being unplanned or instinctive. They were deliberate tactical choices in a military system whose operational logic accepted the infliction of civilian suffering as an instrument of military efficiency. The world that Subutai's campaigns changed is perhaps the most important dimension of his story, and it is the dimension that his personal obscurity makes easiest to overlook. The Mongol conquests of the 13th century were among the most consequential events in the history of the medieval world, reshaping the political map of Eurasia from China to Poland, and setting in motion demographic, cultural, and economic changes whose effects ran forward for centuries. The destruction that the Mongol campaigns produced was real and enormous. The Persian cities of Merv, Nishapur, Urgench, and others were destroyed with the thoroughness that reduced populations numbering in the hundreds of thousands to virtually nothing. Contemporary estimates of killed that run to millions were certainly exaggerated by the traumatized survivors who recorded them. But modern archaeological surveys of the affected regions confirm dramatic population collapses that the local economies took generations to recover from. The Russian principalities lost perhaps half their settled population in the initial Mongol assault through the combination of direct killing, flight, famine resulting from the destruction of agricultural infrastructure, and the epidemic diseases that follow in the wake of large-scale violence. The demographic impact on Russia was severe enough that it altered the subsequent trajectory of Russian history. The rise of Moscow as the dominant Russian principality, the specific character of Russian political culture under the Golden Horde's overlordship, the long delay in Russia's engagement with the political and cultural developments of the European mainstream, all of these bear some relationship to the Mongol conquest and its consequences. But the Mongol Empire also created something. The Pax Mongolica, the specific period of relative peace and security across the Eurasian landmass that the Mongol Empire maintained at its height, created the conditions for the movement of people, goods, and ideas across continental distances that had not previously been possible. The Silk Road, which had been fragmented and dangerous for centuries before the Mongol unification of Central Asia, functioned under Mongol administration as a relatively secure trade route from China to the Mediterranean, and the commercial and intellectual traffic that moved along it was one of the most significant trans-Eurasian exchanges in the history of the pre-modern world. The Black Death that devastated Europe in the 1340s travelled along the same routes, carried by the same connectivity. The Chinese technologies that gradually reached Europe through the Mongol trade networks, printing, gunpowder, the compass, were the enabling technologies of the European Renaissance and the European Age of Exploration. Marco Polo travelled to China along routes that Subutai's campaigns had made traversable. The Pax Mongolica, the period of enforced peace across the Eurasian trade corridor that the Mongol Empire maintained at its height, deserves more attention than it usually receives in discussions of the Mongol conquests, because it represents the creative dimension of an empire whose destructive dimension is better documented and more viscerally compelling. The Mongol Empire at its peak in the mid-13th century stretched from Korea and China in the east to Poland and Persia in the west. Within this territory, a relatively coherent administrative system, the YAM, the postal relay network the Ugadai had established, allowed messages and light cargo to move from one end of the empire to the other in days rather than the weeks or months that the same distances would have required before the Mongol unification. The roads were maintained, the way stations were stocked. Merchants operating under Mongol protection carried trade goods, technical knowledge, artistic styles, religious ideas, and epidemic diseases across the full breadth of Eurasia, with a freedom of movement that had not existed since the Roman Empire at its height, and that would not exist again until the modern period. The commercial implications were enormous. Chinese silk and porcelain, Central Asian textiles and horses, Persian glass and metalwork, Indian spices and European silver all moved along the Silk Road routes in the mid-13th century with a regularity and a volume that made the Pax Mongolica a genuinely important moment in the history of world trade. The Muslim merchants who had dominated the overland trade routes before the Mongol conquest adapted to the new conditions with characteristic commercial flexibility. Many became agents of the Mongol commercial system, called autok merchants, who operated under Mongol protection and paid a specific tax in exchange for it. The silver that moved east along the Silk Road financed the Mongol administration of China. The ideas that moved west along the same routes included Chinese technological innovations, printing, paper money, gunpowder, the mechanical clock that would eventually transform European civilization. The Black Death that devastated Europe between 1347 and 1351, killing perhaps a third of the European population, travelled along the same routes that the Pax Mongolica had opened. The plague almost certainly originated in Central Asia and spread west through the Mongol trade network, reaching the Black Sea ports of Kaffa and Tana in the 1340s, and from there into the Mediterranean and Europe. The Mongol Empire's greatest contribution to world history and its most catastrophic unintended consequence were both products of the same connectivity. The specific contribution of Subutai's Western campaign to this larger history is the negative space it created, the territory that the Mongol advance reached and then withdrew from, for reasons of dynastic politics rather than military failure, leaving the imprint of its presence on European consciousness without imposing Mongol rule. The terror that the Mongol advance generated across Western Europe in 1241 was real, documented in letters and chronicles that describe the end-of-the-world quality of the reports reaching Germany, France, England. Matthew Paris, the English chronicler, recorded the events with an apocalyptic gravity that tells you how completely the Mongol advance had disrupted European assumptions about the security of Christian civilization. The Mongols was called Tartars by European observers, a name that combined a mishearing of Tatar with a reference to Tartarus, the classical underworld, because the people advancing from the east seemed to contemporaries like something that had erupted from hell rather than from the steppe. They turned back, but the memory of 1241 shaped European military thinking in ways that can be traced through the subsequent history of the continent's defensive architecture. The proliferation of stone castle construction in the second half of the 13th century, the rethinking of cavalry tactics in response to the specifically Mongol combination of archery, feigned retreat, and operational envelopment, the specific Hungarian political and cultural response to the catastrophic defeat at Mohi that shaped the Kingdom of Hungary for a generation. The Mongol advance had come and gone like a thunderstorm, but the landscape it left behind was permanently altered. Before we come to the sources and their limitations, it is worth dwelling on one more dimension of Subutai's story that the operational record obscures: his specific relationship to Genghis Khan, the nature of the bond between the general and the Khan who first employed him, and what that relationship reveals about how the Mongol military system functioned at its highest level. Subutai joined Genghis Khan's service at approximately 14, as a junior follower rather than a warrior of any established reputation. The relationship that developed over the following decades was one of the most productive commander-general partnerships in military history, and it functioned on a principle that was characteristic of Genghis Khan's approach to talent generally. He found men of ability and gave them the resources and the operational freedom they needed to express that ability, in exchange for absolute loyalty and for the results that the ability promised. The Mongol term for this kind of dedicated operative was no-kor. The word means companion or follower, but in practice it described a category of trusted subordinate whose loyalty was personal and total, and whose authority within his designated sphere was correspondingly real. Subutai was, throughout the Genghis Khan years, the most trusted no-kor for the most difficult operational missions, the ones where failure was unacceptable and where the commander sent could not be second-guessed or micromanaged, because the distances involved put him genuinely beyond the Khan's ability to supervise. The operational freedom this implied was real and large. The Great Raid of 1221 to 1223 was conducted by Subutai and Yebe, with minimal communication back to Genghis Khan. The distances involved made real-time coordination impossible, and the mission they'd been given was broad enough that they were effectively operating independently across a theatre of thousands of miles. The decisions made during that expedition, to attack Georgia, to negotiate with Derbent to separate the Alans from the Cumans through diplomatic deception, to draw the Russian coalition into the pursuit that ended at Khalkha, were Subutai's decisions, made in the field, without reference back to the Khan for approval. Genghis Khan's management of this was to give Subutai a mission clear enough that the decisions could be made correctly without constant oversight, and then to trust the result. This was a rare quality in a commander of Genghis Khan's absolute power. The history of powerful rulers and their generals is full of cases where the ruler's need for control compromised the general's ability to exercise the operational judgment that success required. Genghis Khan had a genuine capacity for strategic delegation, for identifying the right person, giving them the right mission, and then allowing them to pursue it without the kind of interference that would have degraded the outcome. Subutai was the primary beneficiary of this capacity, and the relationship suggests something important about both men. That Genghis Khan was wise enough to know what Subutai needed to do his best work, and that Subutai was trustworthy enough that the trust was never betrayed. Subutai's reported words to Genghis Khan, "I will ward off your enemies as felt cloth protects one from the wind," are the statement of a specific kind of professional relationship, and they deserve the attention they rarely receive. The image is not heroic in the conventional sense. Felt cloth is not a glamorous material. It is a functional one. The specific material that kept the nomadic household warm through the steppe winter, the practical insulation between the human body and the cold that could kill it. Subutai is not promising glory or conquest. He is promising protection, the specific, practical, unglamorous work of keeping the Khan safe so that the larger project the Khan represents can continue. It is the self-description of a man who understood his role as enabling rather than as primary, as instrumental rather than as significant in itself, and who apparently found this enabling role entirely satisfying across 50 years of extraordinary service. The sources through which we know Subutai are, as I noted at the beginning, incomplete, partial, and mostly produced by his enemies. The Mongol secret history gives us fragments. Persian historians like Uvayni and Rashid al-Din give us fuller accounts of the Western campaigns and the Khwarazmian campaign. Chinese sources cover the Jin and Song campaigns. Russian chronicles written from the perspective of the cities being destroyed give us the experience of the invasion from the inside, the terrified dispatches, the last stand stories, the silence that fell over the sites of destroyed cities. None of these sources give us Subutai himself in the way that Herodotus gives us Leonidas, or the primary sources give us Caesar. The personal voice, the specific decision in the specific moment, the leader as a fully present human being rather than as a function in a military operation. What we have instead are the outcomes, the 65 pitched battles he won, the 32 nations he conquered, the 20 campaigns he directed, the specific tactical choices, the feigned retreat deployed consistently enough that it became a recognizable Subutai signature, the flanking movements executed in conditions his opponents assumed were prohibitive, the coordinated operations across operational distances that no other commander of his era attempted. These outcomes are the record, and the record is extraordinary. The papal envoy John of Plano Carpini, who travelled to the Mongol capital at Karakorum in 1246 and 1247 and met Subutai there, described him as well respected among the Mongols and called knight or valiant. The epithet Bagatur, which was the Mongol term for a warrior of supreme excellence. Subutai was 70 years old when Plano Carpini met him. He had just completed the Song campaign. He'd been a general for 50 years. He was, by any physical standard, an old man. Plano Carpini's account does not tell us what he looked like or what he said. It tells us that he was respected. In a culture that evaluated men by what they had achieved in war, being respected at 70 by the people who had watched you achieve it for 50 years is a more precise indicator of quality than any statistic. Subutai died in Mongolia in 1248, the year after his return from the final campaign. He had outlived Genghis Khan, Ogedei Khan, Jebek, and virtually everyone else who had shared the formative decades of the Mongol expansion. He died at home, surrounded by family, in a culture that valued the warrior's death in battle above all other ends. That he did not die in battle was not a failure of nerve. It was the outcome of 50 years of never losing a major engagement, a record so consistent that the circumstances of defeat, which was the most common route to a battlefield death for medieval commanders, simply never presented itself. The steppe is still there. But before we return to it, it is worth following the long shadow that Subutai's campaigns cast forward into the centuries that came after, because the consequences of what he organized were not limited to the immediate destruction and displacement of the conquest period. They ran forward, in some cases for centuries. Russia under the Golden Horde, the Mongol successor state that controlled the Russian principalities from the mid-13th century to 1480, is the most extensively studied case of a society permanently shaped by Mongol conquest, and the scholarly debate about the depth of that shaping continues. The standard nationalist Russian narrative of the Mongol period presents it as an essentially alien interlude. 200 years of oppressive foreign rule that retarded Russian development before being heroically thrown off. The revisionist scholarship emphasizes the ways in which Mongol administrative and military techniques were absorbed into Russian governance, influencing the specific character of the Muscovite autocracy that emerged as the Golden Horde's power waned. The word for treasury in modern Russian, kazna, is Mongolian. The postal system, the census, the specific style of diplomatic correspondence, all of these were Mongol inheritances that the Muscovite state kept even as it was defining itself in opposition to Mongol rule. The Russia that eventually defeated the Mongol successor states was, in a specific institutional sense, partly Mongolian. Central Asia, the region of Samarkand and Bukhara and Urgench and Merv, whose cities had been the cultural and commercial heart of the Islamic East, was the area most deeply scarred by the Mongol invasion, and the area whose recovery was most complicated and most contested by subsequent scholarship. The Persian historian Juvaini, who wrote in the generation after the conquest, described the devastation in terms that have often been repeated, without the cautionary note that Juvaini was a Mongol administrator, writing partly to flatter his patrons, which creates a complicated relationship between the genuine devastation he was describing and the specific rhetorical purposes his description served. What is not in serious doubt is that the population decline in the formerly prosperous agricultural regions of Transoxiana and Khorasan was severe, and that the recovery was slow. The Timurid Renaissance of the 14th and 15th centuries, the great period of Central Asian cultural flourishing under Timur and his successors that produced the magnificent buildings that still stand in Samarkand, was the recovery, not the original condition. What the Mongols had destroyed was rebuilt magnificently by people who had never seen the world before the destruction and who were building something new from the ruins. China under the Yuan dynasty, Kublai Khan's Mongol Empire, which united China for the first time in centuries but did so under non-Chinese rule, is another case where the Mongol impact was both destructive and creative in complicated ways. The demographic losses of the Mongol conquest of northern China were severe, but the specific cosmopolitanism that the Yuan administration created, the openness to foreign merchants, foreign administrators, foreign religious traditions that Marco Polo found so remarkable, produced cultural connections that would have been impossible under the more closed administrations of the previous dynasties. The Yuan period is when Chinese and European artistic traditions first significantly influenced each other, when Persian and Arabic and Chinese scientific knowledge were exchanged in ways that benefited all three traditions, when the trade connectivity of the Pax Mongolica was at its most intense. The steppe is still there. The Mongolian grassland that produced Subutai and the civilization that trained him is still the landscape it was in the 12th century. Vast, spare, beautiful in a way that the word beautiful only partially captures, the kind of landscape that makes human beings feel simultaneously very small and very free. The horses are still there. Mongolia has more horses than any country its size on earth, and the relationship between Mongolian people and their horses is still recognizably continuous with the relationship that made the Mongol military system possible. The ease on horseback, the understanding of the animal, the specific cultural weight of the horse in Mongolian self-understanding. The cities Subutai destroyed have mostly been rebuilt, or their ruins have been buried under the cities that came after. Samarkand is there, its Timurid-era monuments visible from a distance, the blue domes of the Registan catching the afternoon light. Kiev is there, its ancient Pechusk Lavra monastery sitting above the Dnieper, where it has sat since before the Mongols came. Budapest is there, Buda and Pest on their respective banks of the Danube, the castle hill of Buda, bearing the marks of several subsequent invasions and sieges that came after Subutai turned back in 1242. each of them less far-reaching than the one they were not quite the final act of. The specific tactical lessons that Subutai developed have been studied and compared to those of the other commanders who contend for the title of greatest in history, and the comparison is illuminating rather than merely competitive. The comparison with Alexander the Great is the most natural, since Alexander also conquered an enormous territory in a relatively short time, and is also cited for his operational coordination of multiple arms and multiple theatres. The key differences are instructive. Alexander led from the front in a way that Subutai did not. Alexander's personal presence in the critical moment of every major battle was one of the primary instruments of his tactical system, whereas Subutai's genius was operational rather than personal, expressed in the planning and coordination rather than in the individual heroics. Alexander lost his most capable general Hephaestion before the end of his career, whereas Subutai outlasted Genghis Khan and continued functioning at the highest level for 2 decades after the Khan's death, and Alexander's empire did not survive his death by more than a generation, whereas Subutai's campaigns were contributions to an empire that lasted in various forms for 2 centuries. The comparison with Napoleon is perhaps the most instructive, because Napoleon's operational art is the framework within which modern military education most often analyzes historical commanders, and Subutai's achievements translate remarkably well into Napoleonic operational terms. The central corps, the flanking corps, the corps operating as independent forces that converge on the operational objective from multiple directions. This is the system that Napoleon perfected in the early 19th century and that Subutai was practicing, with less institutional framework but equal operational effect in the 13th. The difference is scale. Napoleon's separated corps operated on the distances of Central Europe, measured in tens of miles. Subutai's separated forces operated on the distances of a continent, measured in hundreds of miles. The coordination of Legnica and Mohi, 2 major battles fought in separate theatres within 2 days of each other, has no Napoleonic equivalent in terms of distance and simultaneity. The comparison with Julius Caesar is interesting for a different reason. Caesar was a military commander, who was also a political actor of the first rank, whose military campaigns served political objectives that Caesar himself defined and pursued. Subutai was the reverse, a military commander of the first rank who served political masters rather than pursuing his own political agenda. This made him in some ways more purely focused as a military operator than Caesar, whose military decisions were sometimes influenced by political calculations that a purely military analysis would have made differently. It also made him more dependent on the quality of the political masters he served, a limitation that became visible in the politics of the Mongol succession after Ogedai's death, when Subutai's ability to complete the Western campaign was frustrated by dynastic politics over which he had no control. The specific tactical lessons that Subutai developed, the operational use of intelligence, the strategic patience that accepts tactical inconvenience in service of operational advantage, the logistical thinking that enables speed, the coordination of separated forces to achieve synchronized effects, are taught in military staff colleges around the world, where they are attributed to their specific historical context, but recognized as principles that transcend it. Karl von Clausewitz did not know Subutai's name, but the theory of war that Clausewitz developed, the emphasis on the destruction of the enemy's will to resist rather than simply his military forces, the importance of operational tempo, the recognition that war is always a combination of physical and psychological factors, describes principles that Subutai had been practicing for 50 years before Clausewitz was born. The boy who walked to Temujin's camp at 14 and offered to serve him became the greatest operational commander in the history of the world. He did it in the service of a civilization that built the largest contiguous empire the world has ever seen, using a military system of such coherent excellence that it had no peers in its time and few in any subsequent time. He did it without losing a major battle in a career of more than 50 years. He did it in conditions of extreme physical hardship, across distances that no other commander in history matched, against enemies whose diversity of military traditions and geographic settings required continuous tactical and operational adaptation. He did it largely in obscurity, as far as the Western historical tradition is concerned, because the people who wrote most of the surviving record of his campaigns were the people he was defeating. His name deserves to be better known than it is. The obscurity is partly the product of how history gets transmitted. The stories that enter the Western popular consciousness do so through specific channels that have their own biases, their own preferred subjects, their own heroes and antagonists. The Mongol conquests happened to people whose written traditions were not in the languages that shaped Western historical memory, and the accounts they produced were not transmitted through the educational systems that formed European and American historical consciousness. There is no Shakespeare play about Subutai. There is no heroic portrait in the manner of Jacques-Louis David. There is no popular novel, no canonical film, no cultural product that has fixed his name in the popular imagination the way that Caesar or Napoleon or Genghis Khan himself, whose name has at least the advantage of being attached to the empire that bears his imprint, are fixed. But in the world of military history, among the people who study the operational art of warfare as a serious discipline, Subutai is not obscure. He is the reference point. He is the name that comes up when military historians are trying to identify the outer limit of what operational command has achieved, the benchmark against which other great commanders are measured and found to have accomplished less, or to have had easier opponents, or to have operated in smaller theatres, or to have had the advantage of communication technologies that made their coordination problems more manageable. The specific achievement of Mohi and Legnica, 2 major battles, 2 different theatres, 2 days apart, planned to be simultaneous, has no equivalent in the history of warfare until the age of telegraph and railway, and arguably not even then if you account for the ratio of the distances to the communication speeds available. His name deserves to be better known than it is. The story of what he did deserves to be told with the same care and the same detail that we give to the commanders whose names are household words. Tonight we told it. It is, I think, worth the telling. The night is settling in now, and the story of Subutai has reached the end of what we can tell about a man who left so few personal traces in the historical record that his life has to be reconstructed almost entirely from the outcomes it produced. He is the shape that an extraordinary career leaves in history, visible not as a person but as a pattern of strategic choices and tactical solutions, and operational achievements that, taken together, constitute one of the most remarkable military records of any human being who has ever lived. The steppe is dark tonight. The horses are out on the grass somewhere, moving in the dark in the way that horses move at night, easy and unhurried. The Sajo River is cold and unremarkable, running through a Hungarian landscape that does not particularly remember what happened on its banks in April 1241, though the Hungarians remember and mark the battle and the king who escaped and came back to rebuild. The Kalka River is somewhere in the Ukraine, running toward the Sea of Azov in a landscape that has been fought over many times since the morning Subutai turned his horses and destroyed an alliance. 65 battles, 20 campaigns, 32 nations. the largest territory ever conquered by a single commander, and a death in his own bed in Mongolia at 72 after a campaign he had conducted at 70. Not quite in his sleep, but close. Rest easy.